Russia has not tried to land on the moon since 1976. Let that sink in for a second. The nation that launched the first satellite into orbit, the first human into space, the first spacewalk, the first rover on another world. That nation has not attempted a soft landing on the moon in nearly 5 decades. And when they finally tried again in 2023 with a mission called Luna-25, it crashed. But what most people don't know is that 2023 wasn't the first time Russia tried to return. Between 1976 and 2023, there were 3 separate programs designed to bring Russia back to the lunar surface, and every single one of them collapsed before a single rocket left the ground. 3 programs, decades of work, billions of rubles, all of it gone. And the story of why is one of the most fascinating and tragic tales in the history of space exploration. It involves the collapse of a superpower, economic freefall, internal politics, bureaucratic chaos, and a space agency trying to hold itself together while the world it was built for simply ceased to exist. If you find stories like this as compelling as I do, stick around, because we are just getting started, and you are going to want to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, to really understand why this story matters, you have to understand what Russia was walking away from in 1976. Because when the Soviet Union ended its Luna program with the successful return of soil samples from the moon via Luna-25, it wasn't walking away because it had failed. It was walking away at what looked like a moment of genuine achievement. Luna-25 drilled into the lunar surface, extracted a core sample about 2 meters long, sealed it into a return capsule, and launched it back to Earth. Scientists recovered it in Siberia. It was a robotic success story. The Soviets had been beaten to the moon by humans. That race was lost the moment Neil Armstrong stepped off the ladder in 1969. But the robotic program was still producing science, still achieving firsts, still demonstrating that Soviet technology worked. So why stop? Why did Luna-25 become the last successful Soviet or Russian lunar mission for what is now approaching half a century? The answer to that question is complicated, and it starts not with the moon itself, but with something much closer to home. It starts with money, and with Mars, and with a decision made somewhere in the Soviet bureaucracy that the moon was yesterday's news. By the mid-1970s, the political value of the moon had evaporated. The Americans had already landed 6 times. The propaganda victory of beating the United States to the lunar surface had slipped away years earlier. And while robotic missions like Luna-25 were scientifically valuable, they weren't generating the kind of attention that justified their cost in the eyes of Soviet planners. Mars was the new frontier. Venus was producing extraordinary results. The outer planets were calling. The moon started to feel like a neighborhood that had already been explored, a place you didn't need to go back to because you'd already taken what you needed, and there were more interesting destinations waiting. And so the funding gradually shifted. The engineers and scientists who had built the Luna program moved on to other things. The institutional knowledge that had made those missions possible began to disperse, and for a while that seemed fine. The Soviet space program was still doing remarkable things. It was building the foundations of what would become the Mir space station. It was sending probes to Venus that actually survived on the surface long enough to return photographs. It was pursuing ambitious missions to the outer planets. The moon wasn't forgotten exactly, but it was deprioritized in a way that would prove very difficult to reverse. And then, in 1991, everything changed. The Soviet Union ceased to exist on December 25th of that year. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, the red flag over the Kremlin came down, and 15 independent states emerged from the wreckage of what had been the largest country on Earth. For the space program, this was not just a political event. It was an existential crisis. The infrastructure of Soviet space exploration had been built across multiple republics, with different facilities in different countries, different supply chains, different centers of expertise. Suddenly, all of that was fragmented. The launch facilities at Baikonur were now in Kazakhstan. Tracking stations were scattered across former Soviet territory. The engineers and scientists who had built the program were now citizens of different nations, with different economic pressures and different opportunities available to them. And Russia, The successor state that inherited most of the space program's assets and ambitions was in economic freefall. The 1990s in Russia were brutal in a way that's hard to overstate. The country went through a chaotic transition toward a market economy that produced hyperinflation, widespread poverty, and the kind of institutional collapse that makes ambitious space exploration essentially impossible. The Russian space agency, Roscosmos, which was formally established in 1992, was trying to keep the lights on while the country around it was falling apart. Cosmonauts on Mir were rationing food, missions were being cancelled, talented engineers were leaving for better-paying jobs in other industries or emigrating altogether. The brain drain from the Russian space program in the 1990s was severe, and its effects would be felt for decades. This is the world into which the first post-Soviet lunar program was born, and understanding that world is essential to understanding why it never got off the ground. The program that emerged in the early 1990s was called Luna-25, and on paper it was genuinely ambitious. The name translates roughly to Luna Globe, and the core idea was to place a network of small penetrator probes into the lunar surface at various locations, creating something like a global seismic monitoring system for the moon. These penetrators would be launched at high velocity into the surface, surviving the impact through sheer engineering ingenuity and then transmitting data about the moon's interior structure back to Earth. It was clever science. The kind of mission that could produce results the Apollo program never could, because Apollo's seismic experiments were limited to a small number of locations near the equator. A global network of seismic sensors could tell you things about the moon's deep interior that no previous mission had been able to reveal. The scientific case for Luna-25 was strong. The engineering challenges were real but manageable, and Russia had genuine expertise to bring to the table. This wasn't a fantasy project dreamed up by people who had no idea what they were doing. The scientists and engineers behind Luna-25 were serious, credentialed professionals with a deep institutional connection to the program that had made Luna-24 possible. But the funding wasn't there. Through the 1990s, the Russian space science budget was a fraction of what it had been during the Soviet era. Priorities were constantly shifting. The program kept getting delayed, redesigned, rescoped. The penetrator concept evolved, got more complicated, got simplified again. International partnerships were explored as a way to share costs. There were conversations with European space agencies, with Japanese researchers, with various academic institutions around the world who were genuinely interested in the science Luna-25 could produce. Some of these conversations got quite far, but turning scientific interest into actual financial commitment from foreign partners proved extremely difficult. No one wanted to bet significant resources on a program that kept changing its design and kept missing its own deadlines. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Luna-25 remained perpetually on the verge of becoming real without ever quite getting there. The mission architecture was revised multiple times. At various points, it included landers, orbiters, rovers, and combinations of all three. The penetrators remained a central feature for a long time, but eventually faded from the design as the technical challenges mounted. What started as a focused, relatively modest mission gradually became something much more complex and correspondingly more expensive, and the funding never kept pace with the ambition. There's a pattern here that you see repeatedly in the history of failed space programs, not just Russian ones. A program starts with a clear, achievable goal. As it struggles to secure funding and political support, it accumulates additional objectives, because more objectives means more stakeholders means more potential funding sources, more funding sources means more people at the table with different priorities, and more different priorities means a program that is trying to be everything to everyone and ends up being nothing at all. Luna-25 fell into this trap, and it never really escaped it. By the mid-2000s, the program had been in development in one form or another for over a decade without a confirmed launch date. Russia was in better economic shape than it had been in the 1990s. Oil revenues had stabilized the country considerably, but the space program was still navigating a complicated institutional landscape, and lunar missions kept getting outcompeted for resources by other priorities. Human spaceflight, the International Space Station, commercial launch services, all of these were consuming attention and funding that might otherwise have gone to robotic exploration. Luna-25 did eventually survive long enough to contribute to what became Luna-25, the mission that finally launched in 2023. But as an independent program with its original scientific goals intact, it never flew. The penetrators were never built. The global seismic network was never deployed. The mission that spent more than a decade in development produced no spacecraft, no launches, and no data. And while Luna-25 was struggling through its extended adolescence, a second program was being developed in parallel. This one was even more ambitious, and its failure was arguably even more instructive. The program was called Luna-25, and it was designed around a set of scientific questions that had become increasingly urgent as the 1990s wore on and new data began to emerge about the lunar South Pole. The South Pole of the Moon is one of the most scientifically interesting places in the inner solar system. Because of the angle at which the Moon sits relative to the Sun, certain craters near the poles exist in what scientists call permanent shadow. The Sun never shines directly into the floors of these craters. The temperature at the bottom of these permanently shadowed regions can drop below -170 degrees Celsius, colder than the surface of Pluto. And at those temperatures, volatile compounds that would evaporate instantly in warmer environments can survive for millions or even billions of years. Ice, in particular, water ice. The conformation of water ice at the lunar South Pole changed the strategic calculus of lunar exploration entirely. Water is not just scientifically interesting. Water means hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen are rocket propellant. A source of water on the Moon means you could potentially manufacture rocket fuel on the Moon, which means you could potentially use the Moon as a refueling station for missions deeper into the solar system. The lunar South Pole stopped being just a place where interesting science could be done and became a place with enormous strategic and economic potential. Russia recognized this. Luna-25 was designed specifically to go to the South Pole, to characterize the environment there, to measure the water ice deposits, and to lay the groundwork for future exploration. It was a forward-looking mission, the kind of mission that makes sense not just for the science it would produce today, but for the capabilities it would help develop for tomorrow. The mission was also designed around an international partnership that, for a while, seemed like it might actually hold together. The Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, was developing its own lunar ambitions, and conversations between Russia and India led to a joint mission concept. India would provide the orbiter, Russia would provide the lander. They would share costs, share data, share credit. It was the kind of collaboration that makes sense on paper because it combines complementary strengths and distributes the financial burden. This collaboration eventually produced the mission we know as Chandrayaan-2, though that story has its own complicated history. The Russian contribution to that partnership was supposed to be the lander component, and for a while, serious work was being done on that lander design. But technical disagreements, scheduling conflicts, and the persistent challenge of funding a complex international mission eventually caused the partnership to fracture. India moved forward with Chandrayaan-2 using its own lander design, and Russia moved forward with what was now being called Luna-25 independently, or tried to move forward. Because what happened next to the independent Russian Luna-25 program illustrates a different kind of failure from the one that had consumed Luna-25. Luna-25 had been a victim of chronic underfunding and constant scope creep. Luna-25 faced those same pressures, but it also faced something more specific and more damaging: a catastrophic loss of confidence. In November 2011, Russia launched a mission to the Martian moon Phobos. This mission was called Phobos Grunt, which means Phobos soil, because its objective was to land on Phobos, collect samples from the surface, and return them to Earth. It was exactly the kind of mission that demonstrated what Russian robotic space exploration was capable of when it was working well. Complex, scientifically valuable, technically demanding. The kind of mission that required years of development and hundreds of millions of dollars. Phobos Grunt never left Earth orbit. The engine that was supposed to send it on its way to Mars failed to fire. The spacecraft sat in low Earth orbit for 2 months, while engineers tried desperately to regain control, and then it fell back into the atmosphere and burned up over the Pacific Ocean in January 2012. Everything was lost: the spacecraft, the science, the investment, and critically, the confidence. The failure of Phobos Grunt sent shockwaves through the Russian space science community. It wasn't just the loss of a single mission. It was a public demonstration that Russian planetary science capabilities, which had once been among the best in the world, had seriously degraded during the difficult years following the Soviet collapse. The engineers who had made those Soviet-era missions work were older now, some had retired, some had died, and the institutional knowledge they carried had not been fully transferred to the next generation. The manufacturing quality that had once been a source of pride had deteriorated. The testing regimes that should have caught the engine failure that doomed Phobos Grunt had not done so. There was a serious reckoning within the Russian space program after Phobos Grunt. Questions were asked about the state of the industry, about quality control, about whether Russia still had the technical capability to execute complex interplanetary missions. The answers were uncomfortable, and the effect on Luna-25 was severe. If Russia couldn't successfully launch a spacecraft to Mars, could it successfully land one on the Moon? The confidence that any ambitious mission requires to attract funding and political support had been badly shaken. Luna-25 continued to exist as a program through the early and middle 2010s, but it was moving slowly, its design was uncertain, and its future was clouded by the shadow of Phobos Grunt. The partnership with India had dissolved. International interest was harder to sustain. And within Russia itself, the program kept getting pushed further into the future. The irony is that the science case for a South Pole landing was getting stronger with every passing year. Other nations' missions were confirming and expanding the data about water ice. The strategic value of the South Pole was increasingly recognized internationally. China was developing serious lunar ambitions. NASA was talking about returning humans to the Moon and specifically to the South Pole. The window in which Russia could establish itself as a pioneer at this scientifically crucial location was closing, and Luna-25 was not moving fast enough to get there first. Eventually, what remained of Luna-25's scientific goals was folded into a revised mission concept that would eventually become Luna-25. The original program, as a distinct entity with its own architecture and its own development timeline, had effectively ceased to exist. Another decade of work, another program that produced no spacecraft and no launches. And then there was the third program. This one is the strangest of the three, because in some ways it came the closest to actual hardware, and yet its failure was perhaps the most complete. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, alongside the ongoing struggles of Luna-Glob and Luna-25, there was a broader conversation happening within the Russian space program and within the Russian government about the long-term future of Russian space exploration. What did Russia want to accomplish beyond the International Space Station? What was the role of human spaceflight in Russia's future? Where were humans going to go and when? These conversations produced, among other things, a serious study of Russian human lunar exploration. Not just robotic missions to the South Pole, but actual cosmonauts landing on the Moon. Russia going back to the place it had once raced to reach, this time with humans. The program that emerged from these discussions was called the Russian Lunar Exploration Program, and its scope was extraordinary. It involved new spacecraft, a new super heavy launch vehicle, surface infrastructure, eventually a permanent presence. It was, in ambition, comparable to what NASA was developing under the Artemis program. The centerpiece of this vision was a spacecraft called the Federatia, which means Federation, later renamed Orel, which means Eagle. This was to be Russia's next-generation crewed spacecraft, replacing the venerable Soyuz capsule that had been flying cosmonauts to orbit since 1967. The Orel was designed to be larger, more capable, and able to carry cosmonauts not just to low Earth orbit and the space station, but to the Moon and potentially beyond. Development began in earnest in the early 2010s with target dates that kept sliding, but that nonetheless represented serious institutional commitment. The launch vehicle to go with it was called Yenisei, a super-heavy rocket named after the Great Siberian River. The Yenisei was designed to lift more than 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit, making it comparable to NASA's Space Launch System. It would be launched from a new Russian launch site called Vostochny, which Russia was building in the Russian Far East to reduce its dependence on the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The construction of Vostochny became its own saga. The facility was announced in 2007, construction began around 2011 and 2012, and the first launch from the site took place in 2016. But the project was plagued by massive delays, cost overruns, and most embarrassingly, a corruption scandal so severe that dozens of officials and contractors were eventually arrested and prosecuted for embezzling funds that were supposed to go toward building the launch complex. Hundreds of millions of rubles disappeared. Workers went unpaid for months at a time and staged protests. The project that was supposed to demonstrate Russia's renewed commitment to space exploration became instead a symbol of the institutional dysfunction that was limiting it. Against this backdrop, the human lunar program struggled to maintain momentum. The Oral spacecraft remained in development, with each successive year bringing a new projected timeline for its first flight. The Yenisei Super Heavy rocket moved even more slowly, with its development repeatedly questioned and repeatedly reaffirmed as costs mounted and technical challenges accumulated. The grand vision of Russian cosmonauts on the moon by the early 2030s began to look less and less like a credible plan and more like an aspiration that was chronically underfunded relative to its ambitions. There was also a strategic dimension to this that makes the story more complicated than a simple tale of technical failure and budget shortfall. Russia's relationship with the United States and Europe, which had been cooperative in the post-Cold War era when it came to space exploration, began to deteriorate seriously in the 2010s. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 triggered sanctions and diplomatic cooling that had real effects on international space cooperation. Partnerships that might have helped fund and legitimize Russia's lunar ambitions became harder to maintain. The integration of Russian capabilities into broader international programs became politically complicated. And at the same time, Russia was watching China emerge as a serious space power with serious lunar ambitions of its own. China had landed a rover on the moon in 2013. It had landed on the far side of the moon in 2019. It was developing its own super-heavy launch capabilities and talking openly about establishing a permanent presence on the lunar surface. The country that Russia had once helped introduce to space technology was now outpacing Russia in the domain that Russia had once defined. This created a complicated pressure. On one hand, Russia needed to respond to China's rise by demonstrating its own continued relevance in deep space exploration. On the other hand, Russia's relationship with China was warming in the geopolitical context of the 2010s and 2020s, which created opportunities for partnership even as it created competitive pressure. There were discussions about a joint Russian-Chinese lunar station. Russia formally signed on to the International Lunar Research Station initiative being led by China in 2021. This was partly a response to Russia's exclusion from the Artemis Accords, which NASA was organizing as the framework for international cooperation in returning humans to the moon. Russia declined to sign the Artemis Accords, citing concerns about their structure and American dominance of the framework. This left Russia increasingly aligned with China and increasingly distant from the Western space community that had been a partial partner in the 1990s and 2000s. All of this geopolitical maneuvering was happening in the background as the robotic Luna program slowly made its way toward an actual launch. Because while the grand human spaceflight program was struggling, there was a more modest effort to at least get a robotic spacecraft back to the lunar surface as a first step, a demonstration that Russia could still do this, a rebuilding of confidence and capability that might eventually support something more ambitious. This was the mission that became Luna-25. And to understand why Luna-25 crashed, you have to understand what it was carrying and what it wasn't, what the program had learned from 5 decades of absence, and what it had failed to retain. Luna-25 was a relatively small lander, designed to touch down near the lunar South Pole and study the surface environment there. It carried instruments to analyze the composition of the regolith, to look for evidence of water ice, to characterize the conditions in the permanently shadowed regions nearby. The science package was real and potentially valuable. The South Pole target was strategically significant in ways that had been recognized since the 1990s. The spacecraft launched on August 11, 2023, from the Vostochny Cosmodrome aboard a Soyuz 2.1B rocket. It was Russia's first lunar mission in 47 years, and the sense of occasion was genuine. This wasn't just a scientific event. It was a statement. Russia was back. The long absence was over. Whatever had happened in the intervening decades, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economic chaos of the 1990s, the Phobos grunt disaster, the 3 failed programs, the shifting politics, and the chronic underfunding, Russia had built a spacecraft and launched it to the moon. For about 2 weeks, everything seemed to be going reasonably well. Luna-25 traveled through space and entered lunar orbit on August 16th. Ground controllers were communicating with the spacecraft. The instruments were functioning. The orbital insertion had worked. The mission was alive. Then came the landing attempt. On August 19, 2023, Luna-25 began a maneuver to shift from its initial orbit to a lower, pre-landing orbit. The engine burn that was supposed to execute this maneuver ran too long. By how much is a matter of some technical detail, but the result was unambiguous. Luna-25 left its intended trajectory and impacted the lunar surface. It was not a landing, it was a crash. The spacecraft was destroyed. Everything it was carrying, everything it might have discovered, was gone in an instant. The Russian Space Agency confirmed the loss within hours. The investigation that followed pointed to a problem with the onboard computer system, specifically with how the automated systems managed the engine burn. The spacecraft had not done what it was commanded to do, or it had done it incorrectly, and there was no time to correct the error before the moon got in the way. The failure of Luna-25 hit hard in a way that the failure of a purely experimental mission might not have. This was not an unproven concept. Landing on the moon is something that had been done dozens of times. The Soviet Luna program had done it. The American Surveyor program had done it. More recently, China had done it multiple times. India, which had launched its own South Pole landing mission called Chandrayaan-3 just weeks before Luna-25, successfully landed its Vikram lander on August 23, 2023, 4 days after Luna-25 crashed. The contrast was stark and painful. India had done what Russia had tried to do and failed. But here's the thing that the failure of Luna-25 really illuminates, and it's the thread that connects everything we've been talking about. The failure was not primarily a technical surprise. It was the predictable outcome of a 47-year gap in experience. Landing on the moon is not something you can simply decide to do after not having done it for nearly half a century and expect to succeed on the first attempt. It requires not just engineering knowledge, but operational experience. It requires a team that has done this before, that has the institutional memory of what works and what doesn't, that can look at an anomalous reading during a critical maneuver and know immediately whether it's a sensor glitch or a genuine problem. That kind of knowledge doesn't live in documents, it lives in people. And the people who had it when Luna-24 landed in 1976 were gone. The Soviet engineers who had designed and flown the Luna series were in their 20s and 30s at the peak of the program. By 2023, they were in their 70s and 80s, many had died, and the knowledge they carried had been only partially preserved. The junior engineers who worked alongside them in the 1970s had gone on to other things during the long decades when lunar missions weren't being built. What remained was an institutional connection to that history that was real but attenuated, like a photocopy of a photocopy, recognizable but degraded. This is what the 3 failed programs had cost Russia. It wasn't just that Luna Glob and Luna Resource and the human lunar program had wasted money and time without producing missions. It was that they had absorbed, and then dissipated, the human energy that might have rebuilt that operational competence. Engineers who might have developed real expertise in lunar landing systems worked on designs that were never built and never flew. The skills that need to be exercised to be maintained went unexercised for decade after decade. And there's something deeply poignant about that, if you think about it from a human rather than an institutional perspective. There were scientists and engineers in Russia who spent their entire careers working on the dream of going back to the moon. They worked on Luna-25 through the 1990s as their country fell apart around them, accepting salaries that were worth a fraction of what they had been worth a few years earlier, watching colleagues leave for better opportunities, continuing to believe that the mission would eventually fly. Some of them were still working on what became Luna-25 when it finally launched, decades after they had first started. That's not failure in any simple sense. That's dedication in the face of extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The failure belongs to the systems, the economics, the politics, not to the people who kept showing up to work. Let's go back to Luna-25 for a moment, because there's a particular dimension of its story that's worth examining in more detail. The penetrator concept that was at the heart of the original mission design was scientifically ahead of its time in ways that became more obvious in retrospect. The idea of deploying a network of seismic sensors across the moon to study its interior was not just clever, it was exactly what was needed to answer fundamental questions about lunar formation and evolution. The moon's seismic activity, or lack thereof, its core structure, the way seismic waves propagate through its interior, these are all things that a global network of instruments could characterize in ways that a small number of localized sensors simply cannot. We got a partial answer to some of these questions through the Apollo seismic network, but that network was limited in scope and was shut down in 1977 when NASA ended its lunar program operations. Since then, there has been no continuous seismic monitoring of the moon at all, a gap in our scientific record that is genuinely unfortunate given how much we know the moon has to tell us about the early solar system and the formation of rocky planets. A successful Luna-25 mission in the 1990s or early 2000s could have filled that gap. It could have been the kind of scientific landmark that defines a program and justifies continued investment. Instead, the concept languished, the technology was never fully developed, and the scientific questions remained unanswered. China eventually deployed seismic instruments as part of its Chang'e program, but the global network that Luna-25 envisioned has never been built. The Luna resource story has its own particular resonance given what has happened at the lunar South Pole since the program was first conceived. When Russian scientists began seriously studying the South Pole as a landing target in the 1990s, the evidence for water ice was suggestive but not conclusive. Data from the Clementine mission in 1994 and the Lunar Prospector mission in 1998 pointed strongly toward ice deposits in permanently shadowed regions, but the measurements were indirect and subject to interpretation. There was genuine scientific debate about how much ice was there and in what form. By the time India landed Chandrayaan-3 at the South Pole in 2023, the case for significant ice deposits was far more robust. Multiple missions had confirmed the presence of water molecules in the lunar exosphere, the incredibly thin layer of gases that surrounds the moon. Spectroscopic data had identified the signatures of water ice in permanently shadowed craters. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which NASA launched in 2009, had mapped the South Pole in extraordinary detail and found compelling evidence for ice deposits that could amount to billions of tons. The scientific consensus had moved from hopeful speculation to well-supported conclusion. The water is there, and it's exactly where Luna Resource, had it flown, would have been looking. The irony is almost too perfect. Russia conceived a mission to study the lunar South Pole's water ice before the evidence for that ice was conclusive. Over the decades during which the program failed to materialize, the evidence became overwhelming. By the time Russia finally sent a spacecraft to the South Pole with Luna-25, the scientific and strategic value of the destination was recognized by every major space agency in the world. China was going there. India was going there. NASA was planning to send humans there. The place that Lunar Resource had identified as the most important destination on the moon had become the most contested piece of real estate in the solar system, and Russia arrived late, crashed, and had nothing to show for it. It's worth spending some time on the specific technical history of Lunar Resource and the Indian partnership, because the dissolution of that collaboration is a microcosm of the larger problems that plagued the program. When India and Russia first began discussing a joint mission in the early 2000s, both sides brought real things to the table. India had a growing space program with impressive credentials. Its Chandrayaan-1 orbiter had confirmed the presence of water molecules on the lunar surface in 2008, and it had ambitions for a more complex follow-on mission that would include a surface component. Russia had decades of experience with lunar landers and the institutional memory of having built and flown them successfully. The joint mission concept made genuine sense as a technical collaboration. India would build the orbiter, Russia would build the lander, and the two spacecraft would be launched together on a single rocket. The division of labor played to each partner's strengths, the costs would be shared, and the combined mission would be more capable than either country could afford on its own. Where things began to go wrong was in the technical details of the lander. Russia proposed a lander design that was more conservative than what India wanted, not in terms of capability, but in terms of landing technology. The Russian approach was based on experience, on the techniques that had worked in the Luna series, updated for modern requirements but philosophically continuous with the past. India wanted a more advanced approach that incorporated newer landing technologies, including a more sophisticated hazard detection and avoidance system. This wasn't an unreasonable disagreement. It was exactly the kind of technical discussion that happens in every major engineering collaboration, where different institutions have different risk tolerances and different philosophical approaches to problem solving. But in an international collaboration with tight budgets and complex political dimensions, these technical disagreements have a way of becoming intractable. Each side has to justify its decisions to its own program managers and political overseers. Compromise is harder when you're answering to different governments with different priorities. After years of discussions, the collaboration formally ended around 2015. India pressed forward with its own lander design for Chandrayaan-2, which launched in 2019. That mission's lander, Vikram, crashed during its descent, a failure that India learned from when building Chandrayaan-3. Russia proceeded with its own independent lander program, which eventually became Luna-25. The parallel fates of India and Russia after the partnership dissolved are instructive. India failed with Chandrayaan-2, but learned from that failure and succeeded with Chandrayaan-3 just 4 years later. Russia failed with Luna-25 and, as of the time this is being written, has no confirmed replacement mission on a near-term timeline. The difference is not in the quality of the scientists or engineers. It's in the institutional culture around failure and learning, and in the consistency of investment over time. India treated the failure of Chandrayaan-2 as a data point in a continuous program of development. The failure was analyzed, the causes were understood, design changes were made, and the next mission incorporated those lessons. This is how aerospace engineering is supposed to work. You fail, you learn, you improve. The key is that you have to keep going, keep maintaining the team, keep running the program. Russia's response to failure has historically been more complicated. The culture of Soviet space exploration was famously secretive about failures. For decades, the Soviet government simply did not acknowledge missions that failed, presenting only successes to the public. The disasters that are now documented in historical records, the failures of the early N-1 rocket, the deaths in testing, the missions that never reached their destinations, were hidden from public view. This culture of secrecy around failure makes it harder to learn from failure, because learning requires honest acknowledgement. The Russian space program after the Soviet collapse became more transparent, but the institutional habits built up over decades don't disappear overnight. And the combination of reduced secrecy about failures with reduced resources to respond to them created a particularly difficult environment. Failures were now visible and embarrassing in ways they hadn't been before, but the capacity to respond with a quick follow-on mission was limited by budget constraints that would have been unimaginable in the Soviet era. There's one more dimension of this story that deserves attention before we put it all together, and that's the role of the launch vehicle. All three of the failed programs we've discussed, Luna Glob, Luna Resource, and the Human Lunar Program, were shaped in different ways by questions about what rocket would carry their spacecraft. This might seem like a mundane technical detail, but it turns out to be surprisingly important to understanding why these programs failed. During the Soviet era, the Luna spacecraft were launched on Proton rockets, which were among the most capable launch vehicles in the world at the time. The Proton continued to be Russia's primary workhorse for heavy missions after the Soviet collapse, and was used for a wide range of commercial and government payloads throughout the 1990s and 2000s. It was a logical choice for any robotic lunar mission. But the Proton had its own troubled history in the post-Soviet era. There were several high-profile failures of Proton rockets during the 1990s and 2000s, including some that resulted in satellite losses worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Quality control issues at the Khrunichev factory that built the rocket became a recurring concern. While the Proton remained an impressive vehicle with a generally strong track record, the incidents were damaging to its reputation and to the confidence of mission planners who were deciding which rocket to trust with expensive and irreplaceable payloads. For the human lunar program, the question of the launch vehicle was even more fundamental. You cannot send humans to the moon on a Proton. You need a super-heavy rocket, something in the class of the Saturn V that sent Apollo to the moon, or the Space Launch System that NASA built for Artemis. The Yenisei Super Heavy rocket was supposed to fill this role, but as we discussed earlier, its development has been extraordinarily slow. Without a confirmed launch vehicle, a human lunar program is not a program, it's a vision, and visions don't land on the moon. Luna-25 itself was launched on a Soyuz rocket, a smaller and more modest vehicle that was appropriate for the relatively compact lander. The Soyuz performed its role correctly. The launch and the trans-lunar injection were successful. The failure happened in lunar orbit, not on the launch pad, which means that the fundamental problem with Luna-25 was not the rocket, it was the spacecraft, and specifically, the systems responsible for managing its engine burns during the critical pre-landing phase. This brings us back to the core issue of institutional knowledge and operational experience. A spacecraft in lunar orbit executing a critical engine burn is a complicated, dynamic system that has to work correctly in a highly unforgiving environment. There is no margin for error. The moon is not far away in cosmic terms, but it is far enough away that real-time communication is impossible. Signals travel at the speed of light, and any command from Earth arrives at the spacecraft about 1.3 seconds after it's sent, which means that the spacecraft's autonomous systems have to be trusted to manage time-critical operations correctly. When those systems fail, there is nothing anyone on the ground can do in time to save the mission. Building autonomous spacecraft systems that work correctly in the lunar environment requires not just good engineering, but accumulated experience with what can go wrong and how to design against it. The Soviet Luna program developed that experience over more than a decade of missions, some of which failed, each failure generating knowledge that improved the next mission. Luna-1 was launched in 1959. Luna-24 flew in 1976. In between, there were dozens of missions, many of them failures in one way or another, but each one a learning opportunity. By the time of the late Luna series, the Soviets had built up a remarkable depth of operational knowledge. Russia, in 2023, was trying to do something that required all of that accumulated knowledge without having maintained it. The documents were preserved, the designs were studied, the history was known, but the living experience of doing it, of working through the problems in real time, of having been on the ground when something unexpected happened and knowing how to respond, that was gone. You cannot read your way to competence in the way that you can accumulate it through practice, and the three failed programs of the post-Soviet era had not provided the practice that was needed. So where does this leave Russia's lunar program? The answer, honestly, is uncertain in ways that would have been unimaginable to the engineers of the Luna program in the 1970s. Luna-26, an orbiter mission, has been discussed as the next step, with a landing mission to follow. But the timelines that have been discussed publicly are tentative, and the program exists in a geopolitical context that has become dramatically more complicated since 2022. when Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered sanctions, and the effective end of Russia's collaboration with European and American space agencies on most projects. ESA, the European Space Agency, had instruments on Luna-25 and had been planning to contribute to subsequent Luna missions. That cooperation ended with the invasion. The instruments that ESA had been developing, the expertise and resources that the partnership would have brought, are now unavailable to Russia. The isolation that sanctions create in the space sector is real and consequential, because space exploration has always been a field where international cooperation has made individual missions more capable than any single nation could achieve alone. Russia's remaining option for international space partnership in the lunar domain is China, which has its own ambitious program and has been willing to maintain cooperation with Russia even as Western space agencies have stepped back. The joint Russian-Chinese Lunar Research Station concept remains formally on the table. But China's program is so capable and moving so quickly that the nature of that partnership may not be one